All right, Chloe, what about Black Lives Matter's attacks on Israel? Where do you think that originates from?
Well, I think actually, if you understand where Black Lives Matter is coming from in terms of its theories about the way the world works, its attacks on Israel make perfect sense. Like I said earlier, many of its proposals that it made in its platform make no sense whatsoever and actually would not benefit the black community at all. And would suggest that they are actually promoting not the betterment of black communities, but a very specific agenda. And that agenda is rooted in this sort of language whereby everything is seen through a black and white lens, where black equals good and white equals bad. And unfortunately, these people view Israel as a quote unquote white settler colonialist state. And that state is therefore necessarily a representation of evil incarnate. And so I do think if you were to trace their theories throughout their platform, again, the section on Israel makes perfect sense within that context. Now, it's a very myopic theory. It's a very parochial theory. It's short-sighted. It doesn't take account for the complexities of world history and of contemporary realities. But unfortunately, this is the theory that Black Lives Matter is promoting and is using to advance its social agendas.
You and the audience should know that Chloe writes beautifully and writes prolifically. So you can find her writings. First of all, she has her own website. And in addition, she's written for many, both Jewish and non-Jewish outlets. Chloe, you've written in Tablet, Palestinians misappropriate the narrative of the African American civil rights movement. Do you equate the Palestinian struggle against Israel to the black civil rights movement here in America?
Do I equate the Palestinian quote unquote struggle?
Yes, yes.
No, of course not. Look, I think that the Palestinian, first of all, the Israeli Palestinian conflict, I should point out, has absolutely nothing to do with the problems we face in Black America today. Nothing whatsoever to do with each other. That's number one. But number two, unfortunately, what's happening in Palestinian society is, there's a very strong strain of anti-Semitism that has run through that society for quite a long time. It has unfortunately been bankrolled by foreign countries that continue to push millions of dollars into the coffers of different leaders in Palestinian society, whether it's Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, or whether it's money being funneled to Hamas in Gaza. And of course, the society also is filled with the most egregious of human rights abusers who, facilitate a society in which honor killings occur, a society in which the persecution of minorities, including women, Christian, members of the LGBTQ community, happen regularly in both the West Bank and in Gaza. And to sort of make it relevant to the Black Lives Matter movement, you even have a situation in which members of Hamas, and CNN has reported on this, members of Hamas have actually engaged in the African slave trade in the Sinai. So you have all these different things happening within Palestinian society, to say nothing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And yet, Black Lives Matter movement, the movement and its organizers remain incapable of really capturing the complexity of that society, because to do so would not really fit with their overall agenda, which requires a very black and white way of viewing the world in the first place.
What about the charge that Israel is an apartheid country? And obviously, you as an African American woman are sensitive to some extent to what the African Americans the African South Americans had to deal with in South Africa. So when you hear that Israel is an apartheid state, what's your reaction?
So I'm actually reminded of a book whose author, I forget, but the book is called The Pity of It All. I don't know if you've seen it, or read it rather. But The Pity of It All is a book about the life of European Jews and the anti-Semitism that was rampant in European society for hundreds of years before Hitler. And I say I'm reminded of that book because, the notion that Israel's an apartheid state immediately reminds me actually of the libels that have historically been repeated against the Jewish people, and which has unfortunately led to pogroms and killings of the Jewish people. And I think it's really important to point this out because I'm very active in the pro-Israel community, and a lot of times, when we talk about this libel about people accusing Israel of being an apartheid state, we like to point out that, obviously the collective memory of South Africans is such that it's an affront. It's an insult to suggest that Israel is an apartheid state, obviously. But I think it's important that the Jewish community also remember the role that these libels have played in its own history and connect the contemporary libel being repeated today to the libels of the past, so that people understand that this isn't happening in a vacuum, in a historical vacuum at least, that this has happened before, and unfortunately it's happening again. And I think if people realize that, they will have some sort of context to actually assess the libel in an even greater and more academic way.
Yeah, fascinating. Beautifully said. Now I want to ask you the question which you began to anticipate. You know that when members of the black community often seem to take positions that you're espousing, they're labeled Uncle Toms. To what extent have you had to endure any attacks from within the African American community for the stands you are taking, first in defense of Israel, and also that you're critical of Black Lives Matter? What's the experience you've had inside the African American community?
So, believe it or not, by and large, I haven't really had any slurs hurled against me by people in the black community, of people calling me Uncle Tom, of people labeling me a sellout. There have been occasionally people on social media with 2 followers who might tweet such things at me, but they aren't really people of consequence. I mean, I've been on shows, I've been on HuffPost Live, and I've debated Mark Lamont Hill on this and other members of that show. And although we disagreed, it never became that hostile. I should say I have been called Uncle Tom by an ultra left-wing Jew, actually, who's not black. So that was interesting. This was a few years ago.
Yes.
So I haven't actually really faced that much backlash within the black community, in part because Israel is not as relevant as dealing with domestic issues, is in the black community. So it's less that people are weighing in on this debate. It's more that it's a largely irrelevant debate for many in the black community.
I understand.
I should also say that when it comes to my critiques of Black Lives Matter, I was on Al Jazeera last week, and I disagreed with my counterpart who was African American on this issue. And I noticed on Twitter that many, if not most people, many of whom were African American, were actually agreeing with my talking points. They were saying that they agree that Black Lives Matter overstepped its boundaries, that they need to focus on domestic issues and stop focusing on other things. So I think that there is room for a much more nuanced discussion in our community about these issues.